Let me tell you a story that happened not too long ago in a small town much like our own. It's a tale of an unexpected visitor and how our actions can have unintended consequences. Listen closely and see if you can unravel the moral at the end. It started on a warm summer evening when the air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle. Jane was working the closing shift at Betty's Diner, the kind of wholesome place where the waitresses call you Hon and the milkshakes are so thick your spoon stands straight up. She was tired after being on her feet all day and was looking forward to locking the door behind the last customer so she could finally rest. That's when he walked in. At first glance, Jane didn't think much of him, just another average Joe stopping in for a quick bite. But something about him made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. He was unusually pale with jet black hair that seemed to absorb all the light. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty, as if he'd been wearing them for days. When he smiled at Jane, she noticed his teeth seemed sharper than normal. "Welcome to Betty's," Jane said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just one today?" The man nodded and Jane led him to a booth by the window. She poured him a cup of coffee and left him to look over the menu. Under the bright fluorescent lights of the diner, she noticed dark circles under his eyes and a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. He seemed sickly. Jane took his order, just a bowl of chili and some toast, then walked back to the kitchen to place it with the cook. As she waited by the window for the food, she peeked out at the man. He was staring intently out the window into the growing darkness outside, as if he was waiting for something. Jane carried the bowl of chili and plate of toast to his table. She watched as he closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of the food deeply before taking a small bite. He seemed to be savoring the taste, which struck Jane as odd. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Wonderful," he whispered without looking up. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. Jane nodded and went to wipe down some tables while the man ate. She kept glancing over at him surreptitiously, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He ate so slowly, cutting each bite of toast into tiny pieces and chewing it methodically before taking another. Jane had never seen someone eat like that before. It was unsettling. When he was finished, Jane cleared the dishes, then walked over with the check. The man reached into the pocket of his worn jacket and pulled out a few crumpled bills. His hands were so pale they were nearly gray, and his nails were long and yellowed. Jane wanted him to leave, but tried to keep her voice light. "Thank you for stopping in, Honorable. You have a good night now," she said. The man stood up slowly, his joints creaking like he was much older than he looked. He lumbered to the door, and Jane felt relief wash over her as she locked it behind him. She kept peeking out the blinds as she wiped down his table, half expecting him to still be standing there staring into the night. But the parking lot was empty. Jane finished closing up, then headed out to her car. She couldn't stop thinking about the strange man as she drove home. Working at an all-night diner, she'd seen her fair share of weirdos. But something about him left her deeply unsettled in a way she couldn't quite articulate. A few nights later, Jane was working another closing shift. It had been an unusually slow night, and she stifled a yawn as she glanced at the clock. Just 30 more minutes until she could close up. That's when the bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of a late-night customer. Jane looked up, expecting to see the strange man from the other night. But instead, a petite young woman walked in, clutching her purse tightly against her body. Jane gave her a big smile, pushing thoughts of the creepy customer out of her mind. The woman grinned back shyly. She had a black eye Jane could see even under the thick makeup, and she held her body stiffly like her ribs were bruised. Jane felt a pang of empathy for her. A victim of domestic violence, most likely here to get a moment of peace. "Welcome, Hon," Jane said gently. "Come on in and sit anywhere you like." The woman's shoulders relaxed a bit as she slid into a booth by the window, the same one where the man had sat. "What can I get you?" Jane asked, pouring a cup of coffee. "Just some toast, please, if that's okay," the woman said softly. Jane patted her shoulder. Of course. I'll put some extra butter on there for you." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Jane turned quickly so the woman wouldn't see the emotion on her face. Survivors of abuse often just needed some kindness, and that was something Jane could give. While the woman ate, Jane went about her closing duties, but kept an eye on her. She refilled her coffee twice, and even brought her a slice of pie on the house. The woman seemed to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing bit by bit. When she was finished, Jane cleared the dishes and then sat down across from her. "If you need someone to talk to or a place to go, there's help available," she said, sliding a business card for a women's shelter across the table. The woman took it and squeezed Jane's hand. "You're so kind. Thank you." She gathered her purse and headed to the door. Jane watched as she drove off into the night, hoping she would find her way to a safer, happier life. Jane finished closing, feeling like she had maybe done a small good deed. Serving people food was nourishing for the body, but a little kindness could sometimes nourish the soul. She fell asleep thinking of the woman's bruised face and how she had seemed so very alone. A week later, Jane was taking out the trash after another busy closing shift. It was a clear night, and she tilted her head back to look up at the starry sky. As she turned to go back inside, movement near the edge of the parking lot caught her eye. It was him, the strange man from before. He was standing half hidden in the shadows, staring right at Jane. She froze, unsure what to do. The man didn't move, just kept staring with those empty-looking eyes. Jane's pulse quickened. She sensed he was here for a sinister reason this time. Slowly, she started backing towards the door without taking her eyes off him. Just before she reached the safety of the diner, the fluorescent lights in the parking lot flickered. When they came back on, the man was gone. Vanished into the darkness. Shaken, Jane went back inside and made sure the door was locked. She was jittery the rest of the night, constantly checking the parking lot for any sign of him returning. The next 2 weeks passed without incident. The man didn't come back, and Jane started to hope she'd never see him again. She couldn't explain why, but some primal instinct told her he meant harm. Jane was working another quiet closing shift when the bell jingled. She looked up with a friendly greeting on her lips, thinking it was a late-night regular. But the words died in her throat. An all-too-familiar pale face stared back at her. Every nerve in Jane's body screamed for her to run, but she was frozen in place. The man ambled calmly to his usual booth and slid into it. He looked gaunter than before, his cheeks sunken and his clothes hanging loosely off his wiry frame. But his eyes were alert and watchful, following Jane's every movement. Jane's heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Trying not to show her fear, she mechanically walked over to fill his coffee cup with trembling hands. His presence felt sinister in a way she couldn't comprehend. This time, Jane didn't engage in any pleasantries. She avoided eye contact and took his order with clipped words. Every cell in her body was urging her to flee, but she couldn't abandon the diner before closing. Jane stood over him trembling, unsure what to do next. She'd acted in the heat of the moment, but had no clear plan. As she looked down at his unconscious form, the answer became obvious. Heart racing, she ran to lock the door and flipped the sign to closed, then got to work. First, Jane quickly searched him, snatching away a wicked-looking knife tucked in his boot. She pocketed it to turn over to the police later. Then she took some twine from the kitchen and firmly tied his hands and feet. For good measure, she looped twine around his waist and the legs of the table too. He wasn't going anywhere when he woke up. Next, Jane tore open his shirt, nostrils flaring with distaste at his filthy skin. His ribs and hips jutted out sharply. With a steak knife, she carefully cut into his chest, peeling back the flesh to expose his heart. After a moment's hesitation, she gripped the knife tightly and sliced into the organ. Dark blood oozed out, coating her fingers. The man's eyes flew open and he howled in pain, but he was too drugged to fight back. Working quickly, Jane carved chunk after chunk of meat from his still weakly beating heart. Soon her apron was stained with blood as she filled a takeout container with the quivering flesh. She ignored his whimpers, keeping her movements clinical and detached. When she was done, she sealed the container and tucked it safely in the fridge. Then she dialed 911 with bloody hands. "Hello? "I'd like to report an intruder at Betty's Diner on 5th Street, she said in a small voice. "I think he means to hurt me." Within minutes, police lights flashed outside. The man was still woozily mouthing threats when they came in and arrested him. Jane played the part of a terrified but brave woman defending herself. She claimed he'd attacked her, forcing her to restrain him. The police were sympathetic and hailed her as a hero. They even shared photos of unsolved murders and missing persons cases, speculating this man could be behind them all. It was everything Jane hoped for. She gave her statement like a pro, not even having to fake her tears and trembling hands. After they took the man away and cleared the scene, Jane finished closing up. She packaged the meat neatly and placed it in the freezer for tomorrow. As she scrubbed the blood from the white tiles, she smiled, thinking of the woman who she hoped was still finding courage to start a new life. Jane knelt and vigorously scraped at a spot of blood. Her actions tonight might have saved other women from meeting a terrible fate. The stranger's presence had brought out Jane's strength and compassion. She would always be indebted to him for that. The bell jingled as the front door opened. Jane looked up to see the woman standing there, her face now bruised, free and her eyes shining. "I wanted to thank you again for your kindness that night," she said. "It made me brave enough to leave." "I'm so proud of you," Jane replied, tears of joy in her eyes. The woman embraced Jane, then waved goodbye. Jane watched her drive away, then locked the door with a satisfied sigh. She finished cleaning, then packed up the to-go container to take home. Soon her neighbors would remark on her improved health and vitality, and Jane would just smile, thinking of the strange visitor who had come into her life and made all this possible. For where there's a need, there's always someone willing to help fill it. So what do you think? As you listen to the story unfold, who did you view as good or evil? Do motives matter more than actions? The story challenges us not to judge others hastily, for darkness often lives inside even the kindest heart.